This is your brain on risk. This is Mind Over Money, the podcast where Kevin Cook exposes the psychology of investing.
Welcome back to Mind Over Money. I'm Kevin Cook, your field guide and storyteller for the fascinating arena of behavioral economics. Recent listeners know that I just finished up a 3-part series titled Fast Times at Innovation High, where I looked at corporate strategy and decision-making from Lululemon versus Under Armour to General Motors versus Tesla. I also turned those discussions inward to allow us to focus on ourselves, on the ways that we execute our own goals and plans in our personal lives, or not. With guidance from Bulletproof CEO Dave Asprey to the Doctor of Innovation Clayton Christensen, who the world just lost in January, to 2 excellent books devoted solely to decision-making processes, I charted some possible pathways to getting more control of our time, goals, and productivity. So today, I'm thrilled to have as my guest the author of a powerful new book titled Indistractable: How to Control Your Attention and Choose Your Life. Nir Eyal taught behavioral design at the Stanford Graduate School of Business and the Hasso-Plattner Institute of Design at Stanford. He writes, consults, and teaches about the intersection of psychology, technology, and business at his website, nirandfar.com. His first name is spelled N-I-R, and you can figure out the rest. If you follow the fortunes and the missteps of companies like Facebook, Google, Twitter, and Snapchat, you may know Nir from his 2014 book, Hooked: How to Build Habit-Forming Products. Nir refers to his work as behavioral design because even though his research taught those web, mobile, and social media companies, and I could throw Apple in there too, how to capture and seemingly enslave our attention, he has always believed that tech companies could and should use the insights and tools to help people create positive habits too. I found this early background from Wikipedia on Nir interesting as well. After graduating from the MBA program at Stanford in 2008, Eyal and fellow students founded a company that placed online ads in Facebook, with Eyal serving as CEO. His work in the company sparked his interest in the psychology of users, and he went on to become a consultant in product design. In 2012, he taught a course in the program on product design at the Stanford University School of Engineering. And this is from Nir's self-written bio on his blog. I've sold 2 technology companies since 2003 and now help teams design more engaging products. For most of my career, I've worked in the video gaming and advertising industries where I learned, applied, and at times rejected the techniques used to motivate and manipulate users. I write to help companies create behaviors that benefit their users while educating people on how to build healthful habits in their own lives. As an active angel investor, I put my money where my mouth is by backing habit-forming products I believe improve lives. Some of my past investments include Eventbrite, Refresh.io, which was acquired by LinkedIn, WorkLife, acquired by Cisco, Product Hunt, acquired by AngelList, Marco Polo, Presence Learning, 7 Cups, Pana, Kahoot, Byte Foods, FocusMate, and Anchor.fm, acquired by Spotify. So that was from Nir's self-written bio on his blog. In a moment, I'll begin our conversation with Nir about his made-up word and concept, Indistractable. But I'll tell you up front, this is powerful stuff. As I read the book and prepared for this interview, I was continually blown away by several things. 1, the originality of Nir's ideas and the roots and cloth connecting them. 2, the depth and breadth of groundbreaking psychological research he found to support his proposals and his prescriptions. 3, the clarity, mastery, and sheer joy of Nir's writing. Malcolm Gladwell, move over. I'll be back to introduce you to Nir faster than you can spell Indistractable. Kevin Cook back here, and I'm joined by Nir Eyal, author of Indistractable, How to Control Your Attention and Choose Your Life. Nir, welcome to Mind Over Money, and thank you for taking the time to chat with us today.
My pleasure, Kevin. Thanks so much for having me.
I found your new book very powerful. And now I didn't read Hooked, but whatever it did for the tech giants of Silicon Valley to make their platforms more irresistible and even addictive, we would say, I think Indistractable might do factors more because it's going to be a guidebook for all humans on how to deal with any technology that might come at us in the next century. In that sense,
I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Good. Yeah. I was almost wondering, before I really dove into the book, I was thinking, oh, this is sort of an antidote to Hooked. But really, it's a prescription for life. So I want to start out this way. Did you set out to write a book on motivation, procrastination, goals, values, in essence, the roots of success and happiness? Or did it just take on that evolution as you dove deeper into the research you wanted to do?
Well, I really appreciate the kind words and the that you kind of got what I was trying to do here. That with Hooked, it was about how to build habit-forming products, and I still stand behind that book 100%. I don't have one regret because really the idea behind Hooked was to democratize the techniques that the world's leading tech companies use to get us hooked. But I didn't write the book for them, right? The book came out in 2014, years after Facebook and Google and all these companies were founded. What I wanted to do was to democratize these techniques so that it wouldn't be all the big tech companies having all the fun, that we can use the same psychology to help people build healthy habits in their lives. So companies like Fitbod have used the Hook model to get people hooked to exercise. Kahoot, company that I was fortunate enough to invest in, and they just went public a few months ago, is the world's largest educational software company. They actually help kids get hooked to learning. My clients have included the New York Times. I help people get hooked to their news app so that they could engage with current events daily. So I really do believe we can use these technologies and these techniques for good. Now, the flip side to my over decade of research into this field is that I also understand the Achilles heel of distraction. And I actually found that, I wanted to write this book because of a problem that I had. I found that even though I understood these products backwards and forwards, sometimes I was overusing them. And it wasn't just the tech products. It was, I would say I was going to exercise and yet I wouldn't. I would say I was going to eat right and I didn't. I would say I was going to focus on that project at work and get it done, and yet somehow I would find myself checking email or Slack channels or whatever instead of doing what I said I was going to do. And so that's when I really wanted to reassess and understand why I was getting distracted. And originally I just thought it was a tech problem, right? That's what everybody tells you these days, that the technology is causing the distraction. And it turned into this deeper exploration. Just as you said, I thought I just wanted to figure out, how to put technology in its place. But I quickly discovered that distraction is not a new problem, that Plato talked about it 2,500 years ago, and that it's not caused by technology, that it goes way, way deeper. And so I had to go into the deeper psychology behind this problem.
Right. Oh, boy, you just you summed up some of the great reasons for anybody to pick up this book. If you want to go deep on stuff about procrastination or motivation or, why you're not doing what you said was the most important thing you wanted to do, you've got a lot of answers here. So there is a lot that I love about this book, but I want to focus on a few key things that really stood out for me and I hope will inspire others to grab it. First is your research. I'm currently writing a book on investing and trading psychology and mindfulness, and yet I've been continually saying to myself, reading your book, hey, look at that. How did I miss this research? And three names that stand out, there's like three B's that stand out right away in part one: Bricker, Bogost, and Baumeister. You've just dug up so much. Did you ever get bogged down in sort of the jungles of journals that you must have had to slog through?
Okay, so this is the kind of question that only a fellow author would ask, because this is the hardest part of my job, is reading through boring academic writing that I swear is written so it won't be read. I mean,
Right.
it's most of it is just horribly written, and I'll tell you why. I'll tell you like a little academic secret here, that I really do believe, after reading thousands and thousands of these peer-reviewed journal articles, that people write them so that it can obfuscate the fact that they don't say very much. Like you spent
Right.
years doing a research assignment or whatever, a research project for your thesis, and you come to the conclusion it's not that interesting, but you have to dress it up so that it can, fill up 6 or 7 pages. So yes, the answer to your question is I read a lot of research writing, and part of it was also that I tried many of the conventional solutions, and I noticed that most of them didn't work. I would try things, for example, the to-do list. I'm about to sacrifice a sacred cow here. A lot of people are not going to believe this. To-do lists don't work, people. Why don't we just admit this, right? Everybody's been told that to get things done, you have to keep a to-do list. And yet every time I ask somebody, let me ask you, when was the last time that you had something on your to-do list? I'll ask you here, Kevin. I'm taking a risk here because we're asking this
Sure.
live. Do you keep a to-do list?
Not every day.
Yeah. Okay. But when you do keep a to-do list, maybe it's not part of your regular practice, but when you do keep a to-do list, do you remember the last time that you didn't finish everything on that to-do list, that you didn't finish every single task? When was the last time that happened?
Probably the last time I did one.
Okay. And when was that?
It was
Okay,
probably in the past week. It's
All
more
right.
like I'm putting it together to organize my mind, but I pretty quickly forget about the list.
Right. Okay. Excellent. So this is a great case in point. So every person I ask, even the people who keep a to-do list every single day, because that's what the productivity gurus tell you to do, you ask them, when was the last time you didn't finish everything on your to-do list? And they tell you, yesterday, and the day before that, and the day before that. To-do lists aren't working. In fact, this is what the research reveals, that in fact, behavior change is identity change. And if you think about what a to-do list does to your psyche, it reinforces to you, if you're the kind of person like I used to be, that didn't finish everything on their to-do list, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, you're reinforcing your identity as someone who doesn't do what they say they're going to do. And then you've lost, right? Then you've accepted the fact that, well, I'm just not going to finish it. I'll just roll it into tomorrow, into the next day, into the next day after that. And so it's pointless. And so I talk about the deeper research behind why some of these well-known techniques that we think are going to make us productive actually backfire, and what to do instead. Another myth is that we can't multitask. How many articles have you read that say, oh, multitasking, that doesn't work? Actually, that's not true. Think about it through common sense. Of course we can multitask. You can walk and chew gum at the same time, can't you? It's how you multitask. That it's called multi-channel multitasking reveals that there's a certain type of multitasking that we, in fact, can do. It's about doing it right.
Yeah. And I mean, there's some things that we need to admit, like it's hard to write and listen to somebody in your family talk at the same time. Like some things just really don't go together. But
that's right. Yeah, if you do it the right way, you can do, for example, what you can use what's called, there's this technique called multi-channel multitasking, where what you're doing is you're essentially doing 2 sensory inputs at the same time. So, for example, there's a technique called temptation bundling, where, for example, in my life, I used to be clinically obese. Now I'm not. And for my whole life, I hated exercise until I found this technique called temptation bundling, which is where you incentivize yourself to go do something you don't really want to do by bundling it with something you do want to do. So, for example, I love reading stuff online, right? And I had this terrible habit that would waste so much time because I would click from one article to the next article to the next, and I would go down this content vortex online and get distracted by all the great content that's available on the internet. Well, now I have a rule that I never read web pages online. Like if I see an interesting article, I bounce over to the New York Times or something and I see something interesting, I never read it on those sites because listen, those sites are in the business of capturing your attention. That's how they make money. And so I set that rule that I don't read it on the website. Instead, I download it on this app called Pocket. It's free. And then I can only consume that article when I'm doing something I don't really want to do, which is exercise. So I listen to these articles. It actually will, this app, Pocket, will read you these articles so that you can consume them when you're doing something else. So that's an example of multi-channel multitasking. I can walk on the treadmill as I'm listening to an article.
Right. And that's also, one of your specialties is you sort of engineered a new habit. That's the behavior design aspect, right?
Right. So that's really my job. That's what I do for companies is I help companies build habit-forming products that build good habits in people's lives. And on the flip side, I help people design their time and attention so that they can live the kind of lives they want. And this entire field is called behavioral design.
Yeah, excellent. I wish I had more of these stories, but I have one positive habit that I built sort of in this design way, and that's eating fruit in the morning. Now, on any given day, I don't really have any. I'm not hungry for breakfast right away, and I don't have a desire to grab an apple or an orange. But a few years ago, I adopted this habit of making sure there were apples and oranges in the house, and then always grabbing at least two when I went to the train for my morning commute. And it was like I created this new habit, and now I sort of crave them. Like if I'm on the train, I'm like, hey, where's my apple? Where's my orange? So, there's lots of ways.
Yeah.
Lots of ways you can design
that's an example of an external trigger is what we call it. So that apple or the orange that triggers you to make sure you eat the fruit in the morning, that would be an example of an external trigger, just like the pings and dings on your phone, right? The part of the reason that we keep checking Facebook and news alerts and Instagram and whatever is because we're constantly getting these pings and dings, these reminders in our physical environment to prompt us towards action. Now, that action can take two forms. That the action can take the form of either a distraction or the opposite of distraction. If you think about what's the opposite of distraction, most people will say the opposite of distraction is focus. But I actually disagree. The opposite of distraction, if you look at the origin of the word, is not focus. The origin of the word is traction. So there's traction and there's distraction, that they both come from the same Latin root, trahare, which means to pull. So traction is any action that pulls you towards what you want to do. So a ping or ding on your phone is not necessarily a bad thing. It's about what you do with that notification, that reminder, that external trigger. Does it lead you towards traction, which moves you towards what you want to do? Or does it lead you to the opposite, towards distraction, something that you didn't intend to do?
Yeah, that was actually my next question. The next thing I wanted to discuss was this original idea of yours. It seems so simple, and yet we've never heard it before. Holy cow. Traction, is the opposite of distraction. And you even created a graphic model of, the horizontal and vertical spectrums for this, which is really cool. So how and when did this powerful concept hit you?
Well, I was trying to demarcate between what was causing distraction and what was the opposite of that. And I couldn't really find the right term for it. Focus isn't exactly right, because focus is what you do with your attention. It's what you decide. You can decide to focus. You can also decide to be unfocused. That's fine. A diversion is not the same thing as a distraction. A diversion is defined as a refocusing of attention. So, if you want to watch a game on TV or Netflix or Facebook or whatever, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not one of these tech Luddites. The people are getting a lot of writing a lot of clickbait headlines with titles like, technology is addicting your brain, it's hijacking you, it's it's all rubbish. It's not true. There's nothing wrong with it, and we should stop, having this moral hierarchy between, what I do with my time is fine, but you playing a video game, playing on Facebook, that's somehow bad. No, whatever it is you want to do with your time, that you do with intent, is traction. The opposite of traction is distraction. So here's another great example. Anything can be a distraction. And what would get me most of the day wasn't the obvious stuff, right? If you sit down at your desk and you start playing Candy Crush, well, that's pretty obvious, right? You're slacking off. You're playing a video game when you should be doing your work. But what happens when you get to your desk and you say, okay, I'm going to finish that big project. I'm not going to get distracted. I'm going to finish that RFP. I'm going to, focus on whatever I need to do. I'm going to make those sales calls. I'm going to get to work. Nothing's going to stop me. But first, let me check some email. Right? How often does that happen to us? And we trick ourselves. We let distraction fool us to thinking that what we're doing is what we want to be doing, and it's not. It's a distraction because it's not what you plan to do. So sometimes, the worst form of distraction, the most pernicious form, is the kind that fools us into prioritizing the urgent at the expense of the important. So it's really important to realize that any action can be either distraction or traction based on one word. And that one word is intent. Intent, that if we decide in advance that this is what we want to do and we do it, well, now that's traction. And that's wonderful, no matter what that activity is.
Right. Okay. Yeah. This is how it becomes more important than if we just label it as focus, then we're saying, well, it's all about willpower. You just have to have the willpower to power against the distractions, power through to your goals, instead of understanding, what are your values? What did you want in the first place? And then how do I implement it?
Yeah, this is a really great point and another counterintuitive insight. It turns out that in the 5 years of research that I did for Indistractable, when I met people who struggled with distraction versus the people who didn't struggle with distraction, those who were indistractable, the ones who were indistractable, surprisingly enough, didn't have a tremendous amount of willpower. They didn't have a lot of self-control. That wasn't a defining trait. The defining trait of people who didn't struggle with distraction, the ones who did do what they said they would do, the ones who lived with personal integrity and were indistractable, was not that they had a lot of willpower. It was that they had a system in place to prevent them from getting distracted. That was the differentiating factor. And in fact, back to another one of these, we talked about Baumeister. You mentioned his name. He was a researcher that wrote a very successful book, a bestseller about willpower, and he had this concept in the book that was kind of widely disseminated. This idea of what we call ego depletion, and ego depletion is this idea that we run out of willpower, kind of like gas in a gas tank. And this is something that even if you don't know the term, many people believe it, and I certainly did. I would come home from work, and I'd have a tough day. And I'd say, oh, man, I'm tired. I'm spent. I've got nothing left. I don't have any more willpower. Give me that pint of Ben & Jerry's. I'm going to sit on my couch and watch Netflix because I'm spent, right? I've got nothing left. And so I was essentially acting as if, that my ego was depleted, that I ran out of willpower. Well, this study was a little fishy. And as we do in the social sciences, when a study sounds a little bit too good to be true, we replicate it. We try and run it again. And what the studies found is that ego depletion isn't real, that it looks like, nothing is actually definitive in the sciences. We run an experiment, and if we can't get the same results, then we say, okay, that finding might be in question, but it looks like it doesn't really exist, except for one group of people. There was one group of people who did experience ego depletion, that they really did run out of willpower like gas in a gas tank, and those people, that specific group, were only the people who believed that willpower was a limited resource. That's it. So if you didn't believe that you ran out of willpower, you didn't. And so this is my mission here. And once I see this kind of research, I really want to overturn these apple carts, these popular beliefs that people have, because it's hurting us to believe that we run out of willpower. It's hurting us to believe that technology is hijacking our brains and there's nothing we can do about it. That's silly. That's bogus, because it leads to learned helplessness. When we believe we can't change something, it becomes true because we stop trying.
Yeah, and that just reminded me of another great piece of research that you cited about smoking cessation. And you talked about Dr. Jonathan Bricker at the University of Washington and his work. But you also cited a 2014 study done in Israel of airline personnel and whether they were flying on a 3-hour flight to Europe or a 10-hour flight to New York, that it wasn't so much the physical addiction to nicotine, but sort of their mindset. If they knew they couldn't smoke for 10 hours, the cravings that they reported were much less, right?
That's right. Such a fascinating study because, when I talk about distraction, many times I'll refer to research that comes from the area of drug addiction. And the reason I do that is because I want to show that if a technique or an insight from the social sciences reveals the inner workings of something as difficult to stop as a nicotine addiction, I even cite work about heroin addiction in the book, then certainly these type of compulsive behaviors that these techniques show we can control that are for something as addictive as nicotine can certainly work with something that's nowhere near as difficult to stop as, I don't know, checking Facebook or Candy Crush. And so this particular study was really interesting. They took two groups of flight attendants who were smokers, and they put one group of flight attendants, one group of flight attendants was on a flight from Tel Aviv to London, and the other group of flight attendants was on a flight from Tel Aviv to New York. One is a 3 or 4 hour flight and one is a 10-hour flight. Now, they asked these flight attendants, who were all smokers, every 30 minutes to track their level of craving. And so the popular theory, what most people think is the case when it comes to nicotine, is that nicotine is metabolized in the body. And the longer time goes by between your last cigarette, the more you crave another smoke. That's kind of what most of us believe is this powerful chemical hook in nicotine that the longer it's been, the more you want one, right? But that's not what was found in this study. That you would expect if every 30 minutes these two groups of flight attendants were registering how much craving they felt, well, then they should both feel the maximum craving at the same time, right? Not at all. That what they found was that the maximum level of craving did not occur at the same time between these flight attendants. It occurred the same amount of time before the flight attendants landed. So when the flight attendants were landing in London, which was about 3 or 4 hours after they left Tel Aviv, they experienced the highest level of craving right before they could open the doors, 30 minutes before they could get out of the aircraft and actually smoke that cigarette. But at that same exact moment, when the flight attendants were getting off their plane in London, the flight attendants on the flight to New York were high above the Atlantic Ocean and reported no cravings. Why? Because it was not an option. It was impossible. They would have gotten fired or put in jail if they lit up a cigarette in the middle of a flight over the Atlantic Ocean. So they didn't report the highest craving when they were 3 or 4 hours away from when they had left and had their last cigarette. They also reported the highest cravings 30 minutes before they landed in New York, showing us that there's a lot more going on than just these chemical cravings. It's about our environment. It's about our mindset around how we think about these cravings.
Fantastic. And I want to point out another great element of your book is, so I focused on the research. You've cited a lot of the research, but your book is really well written. And if anybody doesn't, we talked about slogging through the jungles of journals, academic stuff, but that's not the way your book is written. And, you tell the stories well. And at the end of each chapter, what I love is you do a remember this section. One of my favorite authors, Nassim Taleb, who wrote The Black Swan, he ingrained in my brain a few things because he would always have these, like one of the most important elements of the book, he would say, remember this. And you do that so well at the end of each chapter.
I got to tell you, this is like my favorite interview ever because you appreciate what I appreciate about a book. I read so many business books and, I get to the end of a chapter and I think I could have summarized those 30 pages in about 2 sentences. What the heck did I spend all that time reading this for? And I didn't want that to happen. So I wanted, every chapter to be something meaningful, something new, something that has changed my life. And most importantly, was backed by good peer-reviewed journals. I hate these books you read that somebody says, oh, it worked for my life, so it's totally going to work for you. Well, no, I want to see the research. So there's, over 30 pages of citations in the back of the book from peer-reviewed journals. But I also wanted to make sure that, people who read business books, they don't have a lot of time. And so I wanted to make sure that you could have these very practical insights that you take away. And then if you wanted more depth, you could always go back into the chapter and dissect the research and understand the studies.
Right. As a funny aside here, I have never used Kindle to read a book. And the reason for that is because I love to have physical books in my hand. But I also listen. I have an Audible subscription, and I listen to a lot of books. So the first thing I did is I got your book on Audible. But as you can imagine, since I'm interested in the research, I'm like, I have to see this. I have to see his references. So last night I bought my first Kindle, and it was your book, so that I could look at all the references and citations.
Oh, that's very kind of you. I could have sent you a copy too, but I appreciate that. Thank you.
So one of the cool things you mentioned, which is a crossover to my work with teaching traders and investors, you talked about systems. So it's you create behavioral design for people and corporations, and it's really about building a system that works for you. And that is such a key thing with traders. Not the system that they're using to tell them what to buy or sell or when to buy or sell it. I call it the system underneath your system, which is what are your routines? How do you manage yourself and all that? So a lot of cool crossover here.
Absolutely. I mean, if there's one mantra for this book that summarizes this entire book, it's that the antidote to impulsiveness is forethought. That's really the takeaway from this book, that there is no temptation that we can't overcome. There is no distraction that we cannot put in its place if we just take steps today to prevent getting distracted tomorrow. I mean, if you think about it, that is our superpower as Homo sapiens, right? That mankind can do something that no other animal on the face of the earth can do, which is that we can see the future in higher fidelity than any other animal, right? No animal can predict what's going to happen better than we can. So here's the thing, if you wait for the chocolate cake to be on its fork on the way to your mouth, you're going to eat it. It's too late. If you wait till the cigarette is lit in your hand, you're going to smoke it. If you sleep next to your cell phone every night, of course it's going to be the first thing you reach for when you wake up, because it's too late. You've already lost. So it's all about taking steps today to make sure you do what you want to do in the future, tomorrow.
Fantastic. Yeah, you talk about triggers a lot. In fact, I'm just going to outline the four sort of the major structure of your book here. Mastering internal triggers, making time for traction, hacking back the external triggers, where you actually address, how to deal with email, meetings, your smartphone, your desktop, etc. And then you have a cool section, preventing distraction with PACS, PACTS. So basically agreements and pre-commitments with yourself, right?
That's right. And these techniques need to be done in order, because they're in order of importance. That the very first step is about mastering the internal triggers. And this was a big revelation for me, that it turns out that the root cause of all distraction, it's not so much the pings and dings and rings, it's not so much the external triggers as it is what is happening inside of us. That most distraction, from a time study perspective, we find most distraction begins from within. It's all about an escape from an uncomfortable emotional sensation. When we are lonely, we check Facebook. When we're uncertain, we Google. When we are bored, well, there's lots of things for boredom, right? ESPN, stock prices, sports scores, the news, whatever. Lots of things that could take our mind off of that feeling of discomfort. And so that's where we have to start. And of course, the parallel is very apropos to trading, of course, about the importance of having a system in place, because it's when your emotions get the best of you, that's when you act irrationally, right? That's when you do things you later regret. And the same thing is true for distraction.
Cool. Yeah. Last year I did a podcast series talking about dopamine, because I was reading some books on the brain, and we think of dopamine as the drug in the brain that, is activated by people who have addictions. But I mean, it's activated in all of us. And it's not so much when we actually get the reward and ingest the substance, or watch the movie or whatever it is. It's the anticipation. It's what happens beforehand. So what you're really doing here is you're asking people, let's look at those triggers. Let's look at what emotion were you feeling that may send you into this spiral where all of a sudden the dopamine's triggered and now you have to have this.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So this is very much getting into the realm of my first book around Hooked. That is the core of what makes all sorts of products habit forming. It's the anticipation of the reward, not necessarily the reward itself, but it's the anticipation. And why is that anticipation what motivates us? Because motivation is not what most people think it is. Most people think that motivation is about carrots and sticks, that everything we do is about the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. But neurologically, that is not actually true. That neurologically, we are all motivated by just one thing, and that is the desire to escape discomfort. That's it. Everything you do is about the desire to escape discomfort, even the pursuit of pleasurable sensations. Why? Because wanting, craving, desire, anticipation, lusting, there's a reason we say love hurts. Because neurologically, that is exactly what is going on. And so it behooves us, what we have to do is to understand how to utilize those internal triggers, those uncomfortable emotional states, so that they serve us as opposed to us serving them, how we can turn them into traction rather than distraction.
Very cool. When I look at, our efforts to get a grip on this, I'm going to go with a real concrete example. You talked about to-do lists. Is your answer something you've talked about with time blocking? Like once you know your values, then you block the time for what is important to you?
That's exactly right. So as opposed to a to-do list, which does nothing but reinforce your identity as someone who can't follow through, because everyone I've ever talked to who keeps a to-do list and has a problem with distraction has this problem of not finishing everything on their to-do list. So they do nothing but reinforce their identity of someone who can't finish what they say they're going to do. So as opposed to a to-do list, which is just a list of output, right? That's all it is. And a temporary to-do list is fine. What I argue against is that people just use this to-do list, right? They have a list of a million things to do. And of course, most of them, just get recycled from one day to the next, to the next, to the next, reinforcing this identity of someone who does not do what they say. So instead, if we're going to have a list of output, we also need to have inputs. Right? So if you go to a baker and you say, hey, I need you to make me 100 loaves of bread, that's the output. The baker's going to say, no problem. I need sugar, I need flour, I need salt, I need yeast, I need the ingredients in order to make you your bread. But with knowledge work, right, the kind of work that we do, we have two inputs, and those inputs are time and attention. But if you don't plan that input, you won't get the output. And this is why to-do lists tend to fail. Because with a time box calendar, which is where we plan in advance what we are going to do and when we're going to do it, the goal is not to finish anything. Did you hear what I said? I said the goal is to not finish anything. What does that mean? How am I going to finish all the stuff I need to finish? The goal is not to tick off tasks like you would on a to-do list. The goal is to work on whatever it is you say you're going to work on for as long as you say you're going to do it without distraction. That's the only goal. Why? Because when you say to yourself, look, I'm going to do this task for 30 minutes or an hour or two, it doesn't matter. When you say that and you do it, you are reinforcing your self-identity as someone who lives with personal integrity. You are indistractable. And it turns out, here's the kicker, the people who do that technique, people who use time boxing rather than the to-do list technique, they actually get more done. They are more productive than the people who use the to-do list technique.
Nice. Well, I can't wait to dive into that. Now, sort of the back third of your book is getting practical with, I'll just read it. Part 5 is how to make your workplace indistractable. Part 6 is how to raise indistractable children. Part 7 is how to have indistractable relationships. I love that focus where you're, going into the areas because some people, may have specific wishes there and things they want to address.
Yeah.
And when you wrote I saw a blog post you wrote, I think it ended up on Medium right when the book came out back in September. And you said, being indistractable will be the skill, possibly the most important skill of the future. And I think that's really true. You've sort of called it a superpower before, and you open in your book with an interesting superpower story that I won't give away now, but it's pretty powerful from your own life with your family. Right now, with this COVID-19 crisis, I'm getting the sense that some of these skills we're not in the workplace. we're at home, and some of these skills might be even more vital when we're trying to work out of our homes and surrounded by family and all those distractions. What are you saying to people there?
Totally. You couldn't be more correct on that one, because what's happened is two things. Number one, we suddenly have way more internal triggers. The world is more uncertain. People are more fearful. There's more stress and anxiety. And so what do we do when we feel these uncomfortable internal triggers? We seek escape. And we seek escape with too much booze, too much news, too much Facebook, too much whatever. We're going to find escape from something. And so the idea here is that when we feel those internal triggers, we need to have tools at our disposal to deal with them in a healthier manner rather than a hurtful manner, to lead us towards traction rather than distraction. So that's the first thing. There are people are feeling more of these internal triggers. There's simply more stressors that people look to escape from. And so that takes our eye off the ball, as opposed to saying, okay, what do I need to do right now to protect myself and my family? As opposed to doing that, we're endlessly scrolling the news. We're getting distracted by 1,000,001 things, as opposed to doing the things that we really need to focus on. So that's number one. Number two is that for many people who are now no longer able to work from an office setting where they previously did, a lot of the structure in our life has disappeared. I mean, it's funny. I just saw a story the other day that there's been this spike in people searching Google for the search query, what day is it? Like, there's this exponential increase over the past few weeks of people not knowing what day is it. Because the structure that defined our life, dropping the kids off at school and going to work and getting stuck in traffic and then having a meeting and then having lunch, all this stuff that used to tell us what time and day it was, that's disappeared from our life. One day seems to run into the next, which is why it's so important to impose this structure on our life. We can do this for ourselves. And it turns out, as opposed to having our boss, it's interesting. We all used to complain about, oh, wouldn't it be great if I could work from home and I wouldn't have to, have all these distractions at work. We didn't notice that we have all these distractions at home as well. It's just that they're different distractions. Now we're talking about, our kids being a potential distraction as opposed to our coworkers, and the emptiness of a schedule being a distraction as opposed to the office setting being a distraction.
Yeah, that's where this is, your work is so important here, because you talk about, scheduling important relationships and making those pacts for yourself so that you're true to your values with your family.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's so important that, there's these three life domains. And this is how we start this process of doing what I call turning our values into time. That the way we start keeping our time box calendars is asking ourselves, okay, what are my values? And this isn't some, amorphous thing. The way we want to think about it is to ask ourselves, what is the definition of values? The definition of values are attributes of the person you want to become. How would the person you want to become spend their time? It's as simple as that. As opposed to 5-year goals and, regrets of the dying, how about we just start with tomorrow? How would the person you want to become spend their time tomorrow based on your values? And these values we can think of in these three life domains of you, your relationships, and then finally your work. So for you, and I'm not going to tell you what your values should be, that's got to be up to you, is physical, taking care of your physical health important? Well, do you have a time for exercise? Do you have a bedtime, right? We tell our kids that they have to have a bedtime. Why don't we take our own advice? These kind of practices of, do I have time for prayer or meditation or painting or video games? Anything you want to do with your time is fine by me, as long as you plan that time ahead of time. Then the second domain is your relationships, right? Do you have time to commit to the people who are important to you in your life, your friends, your family, your kids, your parents? Is that time on your schedule so that you can invest that time in those people? And then finally, when it comes to your work domain, and this is typically what people start with, but I think it actually should come last, work has two types. There's two kinds of work. We have reactive work and reflective work. Reactive work is, the emails, the phone calls, the Slack channels, the stuff we're reacting to. And that type of work tends to eat up our entire day. And so we have to be very careful, and we have to make sure that we make time for what we call reflective work. If your job requires you to think, and almost everybody's job requires some amount of thinking, you've got to make time for that. It is a huge competitive advantage because nobody's doing it. Nobody is setting aside time in their day to say, you know what, I'm going to take 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour to think. What are my plans? Where am I going? What's the strategy? If you don't make that time in your day, somebody's going to eat up that time for you and plan your day for you, as opposed to you deciding in advance how you want to spend your time and spend your life.
Yeah, that's great. Something I love, David Allen, getting things done and ready for anything. Something I've always loved that he says is you have to have systems so that your mind can do what it was intended for, and that's be creative.
Right.
So,
without that time, it doesn't happen. People think, if I don't plan my day, that's how I'll be the most creative. And it's exactly the opposite. The most creative and productive people, there's a difference. There's a lot of creative people out there who don't create jack. And so that doesn't count, right? If you're super creative, but you don't make anything, you don't share that creativity with the world, well, then don't complain about you being distracted. But the people who actually are creative and produce are the ones who make time to produce, to let their creativity come out.
I've got to let you go soon. One couple things I want to do. I want to talk about your blog, Near and Far. First, I want to mention another thing that happened in looking up your citations. In the book, I stumbled across Dr. Judson Brewer, who is an addiction psychiatrist and specialist, and you cited a study that he was a lead on. I'm actually having him on the program on Wednesday.
Fantastic. Small world.
Yeah, because one of his focuses right now during this crisis is making sure that people are paying attention to any habits they might be developing. There may be, now that we're in this very unstructured world, some people might be saying, it's 5 o'clock somewhere, a little earlier in the day, and maybe everything's fine, but then does that create a new habit that they didn't intend on, and how will that roll forward for them? So I think he's really good at addressing those kinds of things. You can find him on Twitter. Well, Nir, I'm so excited that you came on Mind Over Money, and we got to talk about this book. I want to encourage everybody to check it out. And one of the best ways is, first of all, just go to your blog, nirandfar.com. That's your first name, N-I-R, and far.com. And you can see the book right there. If you buy the book, Nir has got a ton of great resources for you. You've got an 80-page workbook to go along with the book, which is fantastic. I barely dove into that. You've got other tools, like I think you've got a scheduling or time boxing tool. What else do you have there?
Yeah, there's also, if you do end up getting the book, make sure you keep your order number, whether you get it on Audible, if you prefer audiobook or Kindle edition, or you buy from your local bookseller, doesn't matter. Make sure you keep your receipt so that you can put in the order number at Indistractable.com. It's spelled I-N, the word distract, A-B-L-E, so Indistractable.com. If you do that, you'll actually get access to all those things that you just mentioned, but you'll also get access to a video course as well. That's a great complimentary guide to becoming Indistractable, and that's all free.
Oh, awesome. And for my listeners, if you're listening on iTunes or Spotify, make sure you're subscribed to the Mind Over Money podcast. Leave me a review, leave your comments. And there's always an article version of the podcast on Zacks.com, Zacks.com, where I'll have all the links too. So the links to Nirs Blog and Indistractable.com, and some different things that we may not have discussed live here, I'll have in the article version too. Nir, thanks again for joining me.
My pleasure. It's a lot of fun. Thank you so much.
This material is being provided for informational purposes only, and nothing herein constitutes investment, legal, accounting, or tax advice, or a recommendation to buy, sell, or hold a security. Do not act or rely upon the information and advice given in this podcast without seeking the services of competent and professional legal, tax, or accounting counsel. Publication and distribution of this podcast is not intended to create, and the information contained herein does not constitute an attorney-client relationship. No recommendation or advice is being given as to whether any investment or strategy is suitable for a particular investor. It should not be assumed that any investments in securities, companies, sectors, or markets identified and described were or will be profitable. All information is current as of the date herein and is subject to change without notice. Any views or opinions expressed may not reflect those of Zacks Investment Research as a whole.